So you can hear me fine and see me
Yeah.
fine and everything's fine?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
good. I can now also hear and share my screen. Sorry for all of this problem. It was just a bit hectic this morning with the change of plans and the electricity, as you mentioned, Gerald. Thank you very much for the introduction and, of course, the invitation to share my research to all of you, and making it possible with the change of plans to still be able to do this, even though the physical meeting had to be cancelled. So I will start. So the title of my talk is The Evolutionary Mysteries of Sabah's Very Own Birdwing, and I'm Corné from the Linden, as was said. And this talk is encapsulates a sort of story that's been building over the past few years, and it's a bit of the research that I've done in my master studies, which mostly focused on museum material in the Netherlands, but also feeds into this story of the Kinabalu birdwing and the work that I'm doing right now. As some of you may know, I'm in Sabah at the moment for field work, so a bit of that will be talked about as well. And of course, this work wouldn't have been possible without a whole range of people, people in Malaysia and people in Europe and everywhere. So I've named the key people on the slide here, and I'll now continue with my story. So first, to introduce the setting and to set the scene, I have to start off with introducing Sunderland, the biogeographical region in Southeast Asia where we are now. Of course, we are on the island of Borneo and in the state of Sabah, but it's part of this unit, a biogeographical unit, which is sort of like a continent, but then for species of animals and plants. And this continent is called Sunderland, and it's marked by the light blue area on the map in the top right-hand corner. So you see the islands and the land and the map of the region as you all know it, and then you'll see the ocean and the seas, and there's a light blue color and a dark blue color, and the dark blue color marks very deep seas, but the light blue color is actually a shallow continental shelf, which you all might be very familiar with, but I just would like to introduce it to set the scene for this talk. But this light blue area is a shallow continental shelf, and for a large part of its history, this area was not an archipelago of islands, but was actually one connected landmass, as you can see in the images, the schematic drawings in the bottom right-hand corner. And this continent, which was at a time a continent and now is a sort of broken up continent of islands, is called Sunderland. And if you now move to the bottom left, you see that it's quite red on this map, and that means it's a biodiversity hotspot, which I'm sure you all know. And the region Sunderland is very rich in biodiversity, but also the biodiversity here is threatened, and that makes it a biodiversity hotspot. And the complex climatic, geological, and geographical history that this region has undergone, which are sort of briefly mentioned with this land and sea level change, that is very interesting for an evolutionary point of view, and also the reason why I'm so interested in this biodiversity here. And when you go to Sabah, as someone not from Sabah, you are completely overwhelmed by all the biodiversity. So in this slide, I've tried to encapsulate that. These are all arthropods that I found in Sabah, in the field, and a lot of them in the mountains. And there's just an overwhelming diversity of Lepidoptera, but also of Coleoptera, and beautiful spiders as well, and mantids. And this is just a tiny slice, but it's a huge it gives an impression of this huge biodiversity. But to study this exceptionally rich place, you need to sort of choose a model. And for the model, I chose to focus on birdwings. So birdwing butterflies are a great group to use as a model to study the evolution of this biodiversity. And I'll spend the first part of this talk trying to tell you why that is the case. So, as I just said, I want to tell you in the first section why birdwings are a good model group. Then I would like to share briefly how I studied their evolutionary relationships, and then what I found out about birdwings of Sunderland in evolutionary time and space. And then later on in the talk, I will focus in on the Kinnebale birdwing and the fieldwork that I'm doing right now. So, why study birdwings? Birdwings are very beautiful insects and very big insects, and they're very popular among naturalists. But they also have a good practical set of reasons to study them, because they have a wide distribution across Sunderland. They basically occur from the very north to the very south, and from the east to the west. And on all the different land masses that are left over of this continent, so all the different islands, there are distinct forms, or in each region of an island will have a distinct form. And these distinct forms, whether they are species, subspecies, or just local geographic variations, will have its own color scheme. So you can really recognize, okay, this one is from this island, this one is from that island, and this one is from that island. So you have a really good recognizable set of animals that is different throughout the range, but distributed all over. And what's more is that there are very huge museum collections. So, for example, here I'm looking at the picture of Wallace, and in the British Natural History Museum, and I've got a screenshot of his Malay Archipelago book. But Wallace already started to think about evolutionary questions using birdwings as a model, and throughout, over the years, they have been used for various studies, but there's still so many things to find out, especially because the techniques are getting better and better. But using these large museum collections and what we can find in the field, we have a very good overview of the whole area, and also changes through time. So just to introduce the main characters of this first part, there are 4 species that I focused on, which form the clade, the Amphrysis clade, and they are Troides cunifera, Troides andromache, Troides amphrysys, and Troides miranda. And what you should take away from this slide is that each species has a distribution across Sunderland, but they don't all occur across the whole of Sunderland. So, for example, in the lower left-hand corner, you have Troides amphrysys, which occurs everywhere, but the different shades of colors show different subspecies that I was talking about. So you can tell the ones from Java are from Java, the ones from Sumatra are from Sumatra, the ones from Borneo in the south are unique to there, and to the north also unique to there. And then, for example, Troides cunifera is only distributed on the western side of Sunderland, where it has 3 subspecies. Then Andromache is only in Borneo, as you will know, and Miranda is on Sumatra and Borneo. So you have this modular system with different species that are very similar, and you have all these local forms. So that's an excellent natural laboratory for evolution in this dynamic setting of Sunderland. So now for the technical part of the crash course, I want to find out how these birdwings have evolved over time. And to do this, you need to use DNA. And I don't want to get into all the different techniques that I've used, but I've used very old specimens, so even 150-year-old specimens from museum collections. And then I've broken off a leg from these specimens and extracted the DNA. And if you know something about DNA, you'll know that it degrades quite quickly. But because the techniques have gotten so good, we can still extract usable DNA from lakes that are 150 years old or older, to try to piece together this evolutionary puzzle. And I'll just take you through these pictures. You see here a butterfly, which looks like it probably flew around yesterday, but that actually was collected in, I think, the 1930s in Java, and it's preserved in a museum. And I've isolated the DNA in a very clean facility called an ancient DNA lab, which is shown in the lower left-hand picture, where I'm completely dressed up in a sort of hazmat suit, like I'm about to enter an Ebola infestation area, completely hermetically closed off so that none of my DNA will infect or get into the material that I'm using to extract the butterfly's DNA, because the butterfly's DNA is very degraded, so there's only a tiny little bit left, and I need to be very clean and very precise to get all that out. And then in the bottom right-hand picture, you see in the left tube, you see the leftover fragments of the leg, and then in the right tube, you see a sort of T, and in this T, in this sort of weird T, is the DNA. And that T will be cleaned by me and filtered through various steps. And then at the end, I'll have a DNA library, is what it's called, which contains all that is left of the whole genome, so all the DNA in that butterfly, and that I can sequence that and then compare the different sequences between the different specimens, and so piece together how they are related. So this is one of the results. It's a tree, and the way you should read this diagram is that it's sort of like a family tree. So each line of text at the end represents a certain subspecies. And then if you go backwards from right to left, you come to a sort of junction where it joins another line, and that junction is the last common ancestor, those two things shared. So moving from right to left, you go back in time as well. So you can see at the bottom, time before the present. And this picture tells us how the different birdwings are related, but also when approximately those relationships took place. And you see these yellow bars, they indicate the average window of time when that occurred. And to guide you through this, I've put pictures of the four species that I investigated, which I introduced at the beginning. And they are Troides andromache at the top, Troides conifera underneath that, then Troides miranda, and then Troides anthricis. And each of those lines of text is a different subspecies from a different island, as I've mentioned it multiple times. But I'll now guide you through this figure. So I'm focusing on this anthricis group, which is the one endemic to Sunderland and indicated by the red arrow. And they arose approximately 10 million years ago. And the way they got here is actually from east of the Wallace Line. So the Wallace Line is this big divide between Borneo and Sulawesi, and east of the Wallace Line is where the birdwings actually originated. But they moved into Sunderland around 10 million years ago, likely following this trail of volcanoes on the Sulu Spur that you see at sort of the eastern point of Borneo. You see a trail of red triangles connecting to the Philippines, and this trail is a series of old volcanoes that are located in this part of Sabah in the Philippines, and they were active during this time, and most likely provided a sort of island hopping pathway for the birdwings to move from their old ancestral distribution into Borneo and where they speciated. So that's how this clade entered Borneo. Then the next important point is between 7 to 5 million years ago, and you can really see that the map changed quite a lot. So at this point in time, Borneo and Sumatra and Java really started rising up. So before that, they were quite low, especially Java. You can see that there's a few volcanoes but not much land, and Sumatra is also very thin. But at this time, it's much higher. So there's much more land area, meaning that there's much more space. And space on the map means that there's also ecological space, so new niches. And as this continent is rising up from the water and becoming taller and becoming more mountainous and creating new land patches and new habitats, it triggered speciation. So the clade that I was talking about, the group that entered Borneo, now split into different species that each went their own way. Some going to Java and Sumatra, like the species Corné, and others staying in Borneo. And this time was also the time that the monsoon, the cyclical monsoon, intensified, which also added to this dynamic period, also spurring on this speciation. And then the last moment is the Pleistocene, and this is also what I already said. The most recent driver for diversification, because during the Pleistocene, this Sunderland landmass changed at least 4 times from being a continent, like it is on this map, to being a series of islands, like the state we are in right now. So moving from this to this to this to this over hundreds of thousands of years, multiple times, has caused populations to be isolated and then reconnected, and isolated and reconnected. And this also finally disconnected them now. But during these times of disconnection, speciation can occur. So it might be that at a point when they are connected, they can interbreed again, and the speciation process is stopped. But as the sea level rose, they will again be shut off from each other, and then speciation can continue. And this is what has driven this pattern. And what I've forgotten to mention, but is very insightful to know why this sea level rose and sunk, is that during the Pleistocene there was ice ages on the planet, and they were of course in the northern and southern latitudes. There were huge glaciers of ice, and even on the there was ice at some point. And all this ice locked away all this water and caused the global sea level to drop. And then in an interglacial, like now, all the water is again in the oceans and flooding this continental shelf. Now, the last part of this first section of the talk is also how did these birdwings move around this continent? And you can try to figure this out by using their current distributions and using their evolutionary relationships. And this is a little bit difficult to understand perhaps, but these pie charts indicate for the ancestors, so the deeper junctions in this tree, the most likely area where they occurred. And you see a lot of different colors, but mostly you see a lot of green. That's because they came from Borneo. Borneo is their ancestral homeland, really. And some groups, like Trotis cunifera and Trotis amphraisis, so Trotis cunifera here, Trotis amphraisis here, left Borneo in the same route. And I'll show this on the map now with these arrows. So they dispersed from Borneo most likely to Java and then to Sumatra, following this sort of route. That is the most likely route that we can reconstruct. And then Trotis miranda is only found on, and then they went north to the Melanesia. And then on each of these islands, they made their own, or landmasses, they made their own subspecies for these two. And then the last one, Trotis miranda, most likely spread from Borneo directly to Sumatra. But this picture is sort of tainted by the view, by the lens that we can use, that we are able to use to look into the past, because we don't know exactly how it happened. We can only approximate things. And one thing that could change this picture is there might have been species that had gone extinct, which were on different places and then might have influenced this route. So it's always important to remember that trying to reconstruct the past, there is quite some uncertainty. You can only say what is the most likely route and try to approximate this. But having said this, the pattern that I'm showing right here is something that we see in a lot of animals. So different birds and frogs and also certain plants have also shown this out of Borneo pattern of diversification. And this shows that, combined with these birdwings, shows that Borneo was really a sort of refuge and a center of diversity throughout time. So it's a place where species have formed, but then also have migrated out of. So a sort of source, a hotspot of biodiversity within this greater Sunderland hotspot. So I hope I've now managed to convince you that birdwings are an ideal model group of insects and why they should be studied, and also given you a bit of a taste of how these dynamic circumstances of the past, geology, climate, and geography have spurred on the formation of species, and also that birdwings have diversified out of Borneo, along with a lot of other animals and plants. But how about the populations on Borneo? And that's what I'm currently working on. And that is, of course, focused on Codes andromache. The Kinabalu, or Borneo birdwing, which is a mountain specialist species occurring only, or that we know of, occurring only quite high up. It likes it between 1,000 and 1,500 meters. We have a lot of sightings. It's only found on Borneo, and what is also quite cool about it is that only the white form, the one that's depicted right here, the typical form, the prototype andromache, is only known from Sabah. And this birdwing provides a good model species from the point of view of seeing how all these dynamic processes that I talked about, how they play out on a local scale. So the ice ages that I talked about that cooled the global climate and heated it back up again when there were interglacials like now, they also changed what happened on the land, not only what happened on the areas that are now sea. So on mountains, they shifted vegetation zones down when it was cooler, because if the global climate was cooler, then the habitats that are way up in the mountains now, where it is cool, could be lower down and occupy larger tracts of land. You can see this in the image on the top left, the sort of schematic with the birdwings. So in a cooler climate, the elevational zone where they occur is hypothesized to be larger and connects different mountains. That's the orange band. And then in the current climate, when it's hotter, this habitat would have to, this sort of ecosystem would have to track up and then be disconnected in different mountains. And you should be able to find this back in their genetics. And that's what I want to investigate. So it's part of understanding how ice ages affect biodiversity. And a lot of this is known from temperate regions, from Europe and North America, but in the tropics, this has been largely neglected, but may play a very important role. And I want to investigate this with the Kinabalu birdwing. So what I also would like to know from a conservation point of view is, are the populations connected or isolated, and how large are they? And this is also something you can tell from their genetics if you get samples from the different populations. And there are also two subspecies. The one that I talked about earlier, the white andromache, occurring in the north of Borneo, and then Andromache maripocensis, which is only known from the area of Long Pasya. And they are likely separated a bit longer than the different mountains. But when exactly this occurred, we don't know yet. So that's also something I want to find out. And this is sort of how it looks like in the field, or what it looks like in the field. I hope you can all follow this video. There's no audio, so don't worry about that. But here we are traveling. We're traveling up the Matang River in Long Pasya. And I'm failing miserably at catching the birdwing, which is very hard. So you can tell I have a very long net, and there it is, flying away. So it's very difficult to catch these birdwings, and back in history they had a sort of different approach. So you can really tell that this guy is sort of guilty because he shot this birdwing and brought it down with 5 bullet wounds. That's what they did in the late 1800s to catch these butterflies, because they had to do something. They couldn't return without the specimen. Lots of these people were paid for the birdwing. But of course we don't want to do that, and we want to be, now in the modern world we have to think about conservation and really treasure what we still have of the natural world. So what we try to do is to minimize our impact. And now I can show you a video of what happens when we do catch one. So this is a male. Caught in Longpasia, and you will note that this video is only 2 minutes long. So from 2 minutes, it's from catching the butterfly basically to releasing it. And now I carefully extracted the birdwing using a glove to minimize my impact on the specimen, so to make sure it doesn't, my oil from my hand doesn't damage the wings of the butterfly, but also to make sure that my DNA doesn't get onto the wings. And what we do is we take a tiny piece of its wingtip. You can recognize the male because of the white wing patches. And Isabella is helping me out here because it's difficult to do this with only 2 hands. So this is sort of like surgery for the birdwing, but luckily the wings are dead tissue, so they're like nails. It's like having your nails cut. So it shouldn't really hurt the birdwings. As far as we know, it doesn't hurt the birdwing. And also because it's such a small area and the birdwings have large wings that are often damaged throughout its life quite quickly, they shouldn't experience any sign of reduced flight capabilities. And as we release it right now, you'll see the proof of the pudding. The proofs in the pudding. As it's going to take off and back into the montane forest of Sabah. So that's really great. We can use now this tip to extract the genetic information that is needed to answer the questions, but still leave the birdwings flying around. And so on this map, you can see where we've been so far. This was last trip, going to the areas marked in red are the field sites that we visited. And it's difficult to actually catch the birdwings. So we also take some from the museum. And the museum collections are the yellow places. And they're from museum collections at Kindervalley Park or at Borniensis collection or FRC collection in Sepilok. So this complements the field study, and it makes it really possible to cover a large area. And this field trip, these are the extra sites that we will visit. Linden and Tower Hills have already been accessed. But sorry, I'm getting a bit of static. Is that person? Okay, change the music. They didn't yield any birdwings yet, so hoping for the other sites to yield them. So it's not really known exactly where this birdwing occurs in Sabah, and that's part of the job we've been trying to do. So the Kindervalley birdwing. Investigated because climate changes, ice ages, play a large role in shaping species distributions elsewhere, so probably also here. And I would like to know, how does this affect mountain species? And using the birdwing as an example for sort of multiple species that might occur in the same habitat and might have experienced the same sort of changes. And using the newest genetic techniques, we can minimize the impact that we make on the birdwings and leave them flying out in the wild while still being able to answer the real detailed ecological and evolutionary questions. But there are other reasons to study this birdwing, and that is studying evolutionary questions is often quite isolated from what happens in the field. And what happens in the field is that there are a lot of conservation challenges. And by focusing on this birdwing, which is a threatened species, it's vulnerable, listed by the IUCN red list, but there's really not a lot known about it. So increasing the knowledge of this birdwing is very important for its conservation, and that's a way I can contribute to conservation. And also, birdwings are environmental barometers, so they are fragile creatures with tight ecological links to their host plants. So they are very specialized, which means they're very the more specialized you are generally in ecology, the more vulnerable you are to changes. And of course, the world is changing right now. There's lots of habitat clearing, lots of land conversion, and of course, climate change. And focusing on these types of creatures on this research means that we focus on a fragile link of the ecosystem that might be able to warn us what happens to the rest of the ecosystem as it's changing. And also, the white Kinabalu birdwing is endemic to Sabah. It's the only place in the world where it occurs. And as far as conservation goes, the Rotary Club of Kota Kinabalu has been focused on the species, led by Stephen Sutton, with the local communities in Kiau, and trying to boost populations of birdwings. And they're doing this by planting host plants, extra host plants in areas that are not original forest anymore, but are near original forest, to try to see if they can boost the birdwings number in this sort of half-degraded areas. And what you can see is that it really works quite well. And here's Malaysia's national birdwing, the Raja Brooks birdwing, that has already been feasting on this vine that's been growing there for a few years. And this vine actually contains up to, I think, 13 pupae of different birdwing species. So it really works. And other output are articles in the Malayan Nature Journal, and in general, increasing the knowledge of the local communities around Kiau about their natural resources, and also providing a sort of extra incentive to conserve birdwings, but also birds as a form of tourist income. So what would be nice is if the vines really take off, then there will be so many birdwings that butterfly enthusiasts can really come to these places and see these unique birdwings and see how they develop, and photograph the endemic and rare Kinabalu birdwing up close. And of course, there's another part to this story about conservation, and that is the iconic status of the Kinabalu birdwing. So Sabah treasures its biodiversity, as I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, but I'll say it anyway. You are the Sabah Biodiversity Center, so you'll know this, but on a world scale, Sabah has a huge portion of biodiversity, and it's already known to a lot of people that it's a place of natural beauty. Even on the flag, there's the Mount Kinabalu, and the biodiversity associated with these mountains is regarded worldwide as a sort of national treasure. And you of course have hornbills and pitcher plants and orangutans and Mount Kinabalu. They're all well known, but the insects, of which there are many species of equally beautiful diversity and importance ecologically speaking, remain quite unknown. And this is also one of the reasons why, of course, you, the panel that I'm talking to right now, have nominated this endemic birdwing, this threatened, vulnerable icon of the mountains of Sabah, of the insects of Sabah, to be Sabah's state butterfly. And I really hope this all goes ahead, and it will become Sabah's treasured icon insect, and that people in Sabah, but also internationally, will come to know this species and use it as a sort of stepping stone to get to know more about insect diversity, more about conserving the natural world, not only the large animals and the showy plants, but also all the tiny and wonderful links that are in the greater ecosystem. And all I can say is that saya ini original Sabahan is the Kinabalu birdwing, and thank you very much for listening to this presentation.